By early September 1914, both the French and German attempts to strike swift knockout blows on the Western Front had clearly failed. The French attacks into Lorraine, the so-called Battle of the Frontiers, were repulsed with heavy casualties. Simultaneously, the great German outflanking movement through Belgium and northern France proved increasingly difficult to control. The most westerly German armies had passed east instead of west of Paris, presenting an exposed flank. The new, hastily formed French army was rushed, part of it in Paris taxis, to strike this. The result was the miracle of the Marne, which saved the French capital. It forced a German withdrawal to the River Aisne, but the Germans were still determined to deal France a quick knockout blow so that they could turn their attention to the Russians in the east. From the Swiss border to north of Paris, the front had solidified, but north of Noyon and right up to the Belgian coast, there existed a vacuum. If the Germans could outflank the Allies, they could still achieve a decisive result. Likewise, the Allies, determined to build on their recent success in front of Paris, thought the same. As the Belgians withdrew west to join up with the British and French, the two sides marched northwards in parallel. So began the race to the sea. It seemed as though mobile warfare had been resumed. But each time one side tried to outflank the other, it was repulsed. For a month, the marching and probing attacks continued, with increasing casualties. Eventually, in mid-October, the race ended at the Channel coast near Nieuport, but the Germans were still determined to break through and decided to punch a hole in the thin Allied line. The Germans massed their forces. As they did so, the Allies began to dig in hastily. After probing these defenses, the Germans decided on an area of attack. The place they selected was the historic center of the Belgian woolen trade, Ypres, which stood in October 1914 at the base of a salient jutting into the German lines. The French contingent held the northern face, the British the southern. It was on the latter that the Germans were to concentrate their efforts. For 3 weeks, the Germans threw everything they had against the stretched and thinly held Allied defenses. At one point, in desperation, the Germans sent young half-trained volunteers into the attack. Incapable of advancing other than shoulder to shoulder, they were mown down in waves by machine guns and rapid rifle fire. Afterwards, the Germans themselves called it the Massacre of the Innocents. The Allied line held, but only just, and such were its casualties, the old British regular army could be said to have found its grave here and would never be quite the same again. Ypres became a symbol for the British army in France, which would maintain a tenacious hold on the shallow salient around it, even though it would have made more military sense to have withdrawn to a shorter line. Ypres was also the final German flourish to win a quick victory in the west. The Germans now decided to go on the defensive and began to transfer troops to the Eastern Front. More significant, though, was the fact that for the next 3 years the scales would remain tipped in favor of the defense. Troops attacking over open ground against entrenched defenders, armed with machine guns and magazine rifles, did so at their peril. Both sides, exhausted and bemused, now dug to improve their defenses, and soon there was an unbroken line of trenches stretching from Switzerland to the North Sea. Trench warfare had arrived. The winter of 1914-15 was an especially wet one, and trying to keep the trenches from flooding was a major preoccupation. While the Germans were prepared to make themselves comfortable, the Allies, realizing that the onus was on them to attack once spring came to throw back the invader, were fearful of allowing their troops to become too settled and lose all offensive spirit. Their trenches were therefore often more rudimentary. Christmas Day 1914 saw widespread fraternization in no man's land between the two sides, but the Allied commanders vowed that this must not happen again. Trench warfare meant that new skills had to be learnt. Patrolling and sniping became dominant. Laying barbed wire often had to be done under fire. Trench construction developed into a real art. New weapons began to appear. Trench mortars were developed to lob high-explosive bombs from trench to trench. Grenades became an essential infantry weapon. The early ones were often made out of empty food cans or bottles. The machine guns of the day were soon found to be too cumbersome to handle in the narrow confines of the trenches, and a new lighter breed of automatic weapon, like the British Lewis gun and French Chauchat, began to join them. Opposing front-line trenches were sometimes as little as 100 yards from each other, and any visible movement by day inevitably attracted the enemy's fire. Night, therefore, became the time for work. While day was for rest and recuperation. While the frontline soldiers were grappling with this new form of warfare, the Allied politicians and commanders spent the winter working out how they could break the deadlock. Two schools of thought came into being. The Westerners argued that because the bulk of the German forces were in France and Flanders, it was only on the Western front that a decisive blow could be struck. The Easterners, led by Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty, stated that since there was stalemate in the West, the Allies should look elsewhere to apply pressure. The result was the ill-fated attempt to seize the Dardanelles and knock out Germany's ally, Turkey. In the meantime, on the Western Front, the planners had been busy, and the Allied commander, still the phlegmatic Joseph Joffre, known to his troops as Papa, issued a directive in February 1915. The French were to strike simultaneous blows in Artois and Champagne, the shoulders of the great German salient. To threaten German communications, there would also be a thrust into Lorraine. The British contribution was to be a limited attack in support of the French effort in Artois. The first Allied spring offensive was carried out amid mud, and in the mountains of Lorraine, heavy snow. It set the pattern for the next 3 years. The opening barrage would pound the enemy trenches. It was designed to destroy the barbed wire and the defenses behind it, as well as demoralize the defenders. The attackers would then charge across no man's land. This would include struggling through the wire in front of the defenders' trenches, all the time men falling to machine gun and rifle fire. Once the attackers had reached the trench line, they became involved in a bloody hand-to-hand scuffle with bayonets, rifle butts, and fists. The few surviving attackers now needed to consolidate. If they were not very quick to do so, they would be driven out again, suffering more casualties from the inevitable counterattack. Often the only means of communication was the runner, and too many never made it back across no man's land, which meant that anxiously waiting commanders had no clear idea what was happening. The veritable fog of war. The result so often was that the pitiful small numbers of surviving attackers were left to fight it out on their own and perished. The reserves would then have to attack in the same place, and so it went on. All the time, casualties, both killed and wounded, mounted, until the attackers were forced to stop. Examining why these early attacks had failed, the Allies concluded that the German trench systems had not yet been pulverized enough. More artillery was needed. It must bombard the German trenches for much longer before the attack went in. This was easier said than done. Field guns like this French 75, the German 77mm, the British 18-pounder, did not pack enough explosive power in their shells to cause major trench destruction. As for heavier artillery, what pieces the French and British had were relatively few in quantity and often old-fashioned and inaccurate. The Germans, on the other hand, had a large amount of heavy artillery from the outset. They had needed it to break through the Belgian frontier forts. Worse, by early 1915, the British especially had virtually expended all their stocks of ammunition, and guns had to be rationed to as little as 2 rounds per day. It took a newspaper magnate, Lord Northcliffe, to galvanize the British government into taking urgent action to set up more ammunition factories. Many of those who came to work in these